Pink Floyd's influence on music is a little bit more muted these days, at least in conversation, but it is still one that is massive and can still be felt during this generation of prog rock fans and prog rock bands. In fact, anytime you talk about progressive music in general, either that or classic rock, Pink Floyd's name tends to still come up. They are one of those generational bands that continue to find a fan base even though they haven't released new material, quote unquote, for more than 15 years. So this band's importance means that their discography must have just a wide, vast variety of differing ideas, which it indeed does. And for that reason, we need to rank them from worst to best to see which ones should be sought after by the new fan and which ones should be more for the die-hard, experienced collector, the one who wants to dig deep into Pink Floyd's reservoirs that are perhaps a little less well known. I'm Cover Killer Nation. Don't forget to like and subscribe and put your own list in the comments below. And it's time for us to rank them all Pink Floyd. And we start with 15. Number 15 is The Endless River. Now this was an album that was released just a couple of years ago, and it was constructed from some ideas that were being formulated after the release of The Division Bell, their very final studio album up to that point. This is a mostly instrumental album with only one track that has lyricism, and while it is an extremely soothing and almost relaxing listen, it's one that feels a little bit forced, almost as though they discovered the material and just decided to put it together and ship it out. For the die-hard collector and for those that need to have that sense of completion, this is an absolutely necessary album, considering the relaxation experience is pretty good. But for the person who's just starting to get into the band, this is probably a poor place to start. You might get bored. Still a pretty awesome experience, at least for me. It was neat to have another Pink Floyd album released in my lifetime, but yeah. Number 14 is The Final Cut. The last album with Roger Waters was one that he dominated, and he turned it into a bit of a personal affair, and as a result, this felt like a very inferior follow-up to the album that preceded it, which is the double disc The Wall. But this album still does have some value considering the personal nature of these songs, which felt a lot more like a Roger Waters studio album, which we would get plenty of later on in the 1980s. This album still felt like it was somewhat different than that which had preceded it, but still retained a little bit of Pink Floyd charm. Those that loved the songwriting structure of The Wall were a bit confused by this, but the diehards have been able to find some real great gems hidden among this disc. Consequently enough, this was also the first Pink Floyd album I ever owned, and despite that, I still went on and continued to collect and find and seek out their material, despite not really enjoying this album all that much. Number 13 is More, or the soundtrack to the film More. And this is one of the, again, is more for the die-hard collectors. The Pink Floyd's 1970s, their early 1970s, were kind of interesting, considering they did a couple of soundtracks to some films that you perhaps have never heard or never have seen, and also had some just wild and crazy out there albums. The soundtrack, The More, is definitely within that structure. However, it still is able to contain some pleasant enough soundscapes that it is encouraging to the listener that their studio stuff was going to be taking on this very psychedelic direction like they had been experiencing, although it does have some softer quantities. This was beyond Syd Barrett's influence on the band, so it sounded a bit different than, say, A Saucer Full of Secrets, either that or Piper at the Gates of Dawn, but it still showed a band that was extremely capable and could actually branch out to craft a very sensible but also extremely interesting soundtrack for a film. Number 12 is Obscured by Clouds, the other one that is seen a little bit more within that same light, and this is one that is interesting considering it's almost like a studio album that feels like a soundtrack, and it has the quantities and the qualities that you saw on More scattered without. However, it has a little bit more of a light touch to it, and as a result, once again, this is going to be not the first album that a new fan's going to seek out, but instead one that is going to be there for collection purposes later, and hopefully, to get something that's worth a couple bucks. Now, that's unfortunately not true, but Obscured by Clouds does show Pink Floyd's light touch once again, and is splayed right within a fruitful time, that same 1970s early period, where they were trying just about everything to see what was going to be the best identity for themselves. Number 11 is Ummagumma. Speaking of identity, this was a large album that had a lot of different ideas thrown within it, including large cycle that was, wow. There is just some out there material on this disc, considering it has sort of the spontaneity of a live album, which is somewhat present, but also the strangeness of a studio record where most of the members of Pink Floyd were bringing their own ideas to the table. And again, very similar to what I've mentioned with previous entries so far, they were kind of seeing what was going to stick. As a result, we have a sort of jilted album that feels a bit imbalanced in locations, but does save itself very nicely whenever it's played as a whole. Whenever that happens, it doesn't feel quite as disjointed, but you can definitely tell each member's separate touch with the separate tracks that you got on disc number 2. This is an interesting album. Again, one that's going to be a nice late night delve for a fan that has become experienced and knowledgeable with some of the band's bigger hits, but wants to see some of the things that are sometimes dusted under the rug. Ummagumma is a good place to start. Consequently, number 10 is Atom Heart Mother, and if you want to go into another album that feels very similar to this, only a bit more well put together, Atom Heart Mother is going to have to be your pick. Once again, this shows the overall creativity that this band does possess, and before it got really sort of self-contained and they started to understand more of what their identity was with their classics, this one was one of their last great big hurrahs whenever it came to spontaneity, whenever it came to really trying a lot of different things and experimenting with sound prior to their breakout years. This is a really interesting and, again, admittedly very creative album that feels a lot like it could really inspire more than just a classic rock or a progressive music band, but it inspires somebody that wants to just make artistic music that bends the rules and doesn't exactly conform to the conventions that you would expect. Number 9 is A Saucer Full of Secrets. This is the second and final of the Syd Barrett albums, and this is one that, despite Piper's great recognition and great reputation, Saucerful sometimes gets some mixed reviews. Some call it to be the strongest of the two Syd Barrett albums, while others are a little bit more confused and jilted by it, feeling like this was the sounds of a man that was slowly but surely losing his mind, which of course was sort of what was happening to Syd, and his solo albums would be proof of that. But this is an album that definitely has a lot of great historical perspective to what this band potentially could have been had Syd remained as part of the product. This is a very strange and very psychedelic trip, one that certainly magnifies those that are supposedly experienced with albums such as Dark Side of the Moon even tenfold, just really taking the conventions of music and bowing them a little bit, almost if by doing so through telekinesis. This was very prominent in the time during the latter portions of the 1960s, so Pink Floyd not only fit in, but also felt like a frontrunner or felt like a real stalwart, a group that could easily be latched onto during the psychedelic movement. And as a result, this is still an album that to this day is sought out by fans, and especially those newer ones that perhaps want to experience the Syd Barrett majesty while under the influence themselves. Number 8 is The Division Bell. The very last album of Pink Floyd's discography prior to The Endless River is one that has some mixed results. By this point, Roger Waters was gone from the band. They were really at a point where they were unsure how much further or how much longer the band would go on, and The Division Bell did prove to be their breaking point. This is an album that honestly should have remained their last album if we're being completely and totally selfish, considering the final track on this album, High Hopes, feels like the most fitting and almost tragic goodbye out of any song that you're going to hear that happens to be the final track of their discography. The Endless River kind of messed that up a little bit, but it's okay. You can understand why they released it, sort of. But The Division Bell was a disc that didn't feel quite as strong as its David Gilmour-led predecessor, but still had some great material and showed that the band still had great chops into the 1990s. Number 7 is A Momentary Lapse of Reason. Speaking of that album that we were just discussing, A Momentary Lapse of Reason was released in the latter portions of the 1980s. It was the first album in the post-Waters Dream, and David Gilmour and company were able to still craft some great and very meaningful songs, still exploring some subtle values of psychedelia while also taking a little bit more of a hard rock edge. Now, this was not necessarily one that was trying to follow the trends of the time. It still retained Pink Floyd's classic veneer, but what was different about this and what caused some some fans to really be curious about it is how David Gilmour's voice would sound as the head of this group as opposed to Roger Waters. It was a transition that was actually not too bad, and Waters' voice feels very iconic by its own right. But again, these are two albums that you don't hear nearly as much from, say on the radio, as their hits, but still contains some pretty good material. After all, Roger Waters was one of the biggest influences of Pink Floyd, but David Gilmour was right there as well, and his guitar touch is something that proved to be the Achilles heel of this band during this time period, considering it was right there and present, but apparently was not what the fans wanted. Number 6 is The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. The iconic debut of Pink Floyd is one that is still seen as a very important piece of psychedelic art, and this album still contains some of the strangest concoctions that Pink Floyd has ever set to tape. They were still a very disorganized band, one that was not necessarily taking their own maturity or their own identity very seriously, instead opting to have this very unknown identity where they could be very unpredictable. You know, the drugs definitely helped Syd, but as a result, this disc though does feel like it has moments of pure genius, and its airy, very psychedelic landscape is one that fits the canvas of its mold very nicely. It definitely gave the psychedelic movement a big name, despite the fact that they weren't big yet. It's one that in hindsight, in retrospect, and for historical context, feels like it should have been the champion of this movement, that it should have been the George Washington crossing the Delaware with the remainder of the psychedelic movement. But instead that wasn't the case. They were a band trying to make it just like everybody else, and this debut certainly helped to attract a lot of attention right early on in their career. Number 5, we have The Wall. This might insult some fans. This is the double disc that is to end all double discs. Most fans adore this album. I am no different. Whenever it came into the charts, it stayed there for a very, very long time. It was able to join its brother, which we'll talk about later, Dark Side of the Moon, and Pink Floyd at this point was just ruling the school, literally by saying that they didn't need no education. This is a sprawling concept album, considered to be one of the best of all time, and is an all-time favorite among fans. And this is still a benchmark and crowning achievement that may have helped to popularize later on the whole idea of concept albums within progressive or classic rock music, and made it a little bit more cool. Between them and other prog rock groups, or even some rock groups like The Who with Tommy, it showed that there was a real market for telling stories through music and being able to allow both the words and the tunes really tell the emotional tone. This is a great disc. Being at number 5, like I said, may insult some, but this is my list. Tell me yours in the comments. Number 4 is Meddle. This is such a cool album based off of the fact that it's an early 70s option from this band, and it feels like, despite its noticeable differences in tone, a very complete disc. And it's complete in the fact that it has a lot of different ideas, so that way you get a little bit of variety. Not to mention, this contains one of the biggest and arguably one of the best Pink Floyd songs to ever be released, that being the iconic Echoes, which of course was sampled with the Phantom of the Opera, and yeah. There's a lot of history within that song just by itself, and there is so much that is included within that iconic song and this iconic album that it is now envisioned and gained a sort of a rebellious reputation among the elite Pink Floyd records, if not just for Echoes alone. This is also an album that in recent times has experienced a bit of a revival. I can recall that whenever the most recent set of remasters were sold, that Meddle was one that was hard to keep in stock. This was the one that was a little bit harder for fans to find in the past, as opposed to some of the bigger classics. One way or another, Meddle continues to be a very important piece of musical history, and progressive music fans will cite it to death to this day. Number 3 is Dark Side of the Moon. Is this going to insult some people? Who knows? Once again, this is the iconic Pink Floyd album, the one that has spent the most time on the Billboard charts, not to mention the album that has been said to be synchronized with Alice in Wonderland and has 1,001 different iterations of things that you can do with it in order to have a good time, substances included. This album is terrific, spawned a ton of singles, and really the whole entire album feels like it should just be played from front to back whenever one song comes on the radio. You should just play all of Dark Side. It's a terrific disc. But this is also one whose identity showed the band finally reaching that stepping stone of maturity and focus, where they were able to just place all of these terrific ideas together with very simplistic themology such as money or time, and still craft an album that felt like it was important not only for the world but for the generation that was living within it. But it's also timeless, considering those of us that listen to it in 2019 hear these same themes and understand their relevance just the same. It's almost as though Pink Floyd made an album that transcends time and space, that actually is 100% worth the money. And really, it just sort of speaks to you. Run, rabbit, run. Dark Side will always be seen as that album. It'll be seen as Pink Floyd's signature achievement. But it's number 3 on this list. We still have 2 more to talk about. And number 2 is Wish You Were Here. This one is absolutely iconic. This was dedicated to Syd Barrett, and you could tell simply by the tone that this album really took on. This was one where really concerned about their friend and really concerned about his life and everything that was going on, the band decided to be a little bit personal, and it worked out very well. We also got iconic tracks such as Have a Cigar or Welcome to the Machine that still maintain themselves as occasional radio singles alongside of Wish You Were Here, and oh yeah, every so often you hear a bit of Shine On You Crazy Diamond, whether it be the first or the last part, typically the first. So yeah, this is an album where literally almost every song on it was a single, or could have been utilized as a single by the radios. This is a terrific album, and its guitar bending is absolutely fantastic. Its overall approach to the theme of loss and death, or it almost takes a plight to the romantic, considering the idea of being just two fishbowl, or we are just two lost souls living in a fishbowl year after year. I know that that's a line that has not just been used in order to associate with friendship. Trust me, Facebook is a weird place. But this album also feels bigger than itself, considering it almost feels like a ritual to channel somebody that you have really lost within your life. It feels like something that whenever you listen to this, for some strange reason, they might be listening to it at the exact same time. And there's that unity that perhaps may even go beyond borders and maybe go beyond realities in order to link you. It has that special quantity and quality to it. But number 1, Animals, has something that's even better than that. And that's the fact that this is just the most solid and just well put together Pink Floyd release of all time. This disc may not get the contemporary love of its brothers, such as Wish You Were Here, Dark Side of the Moon, The Wall, and even Meddle. It may not have the historical context of its forefathers, such as The Piper at the Gates of Dawn and Saucer Full of Secrets. It may not have the endless creativity of Ummagumma or Obscured by Clouds. And it may not have the reputation of The Wall, either that or the desired reputation of albums such as The Division Bell. But what Animals has is a very unique story that's taken straight out of the pages of Animal Farm and applied to how the world was at that very time, associating the pigs and the dogs and the sheep to their proper roles. And each song tackles one of those roles, with Dogs perhaps being the best song of all time for Pink Floyd. It's really kind of a debate. Whenever they went long, their songs were golden, and Dogs is incredible. This is one that sprawls through potent lyricism that sometimes feels very demanding, either that or very impatient. It also has a terrific solo portion that's able to slow the song down and really give you a nice feel. And then it flurries to a finish. You hear simple things such as snorts of pigs, bays of sheep, barkings of dogs. It's a very simple message. While this might not transcend reality so you can link yourself with a friend, while this might not be the ideal smoker-friendly experience and the real way to listen to Alice in Wonderland, Animals, I think, is the one that gives you the biggest musical boner. It's the one where you sit in your room or lay in your room and space out, and instead of transcending reality or getting high, you transcend and see the universe itself. There's an understanding to the world that surrounds, which causes a bit of anger, but then there's also all the calming bits that remind you that you're still here and that everything is still fine. It's a great album. It's one that feels bigger than it ever possibly could have been. And in reality, it kind of was. Animals is the one album throughout this late 1970s cycle that's oftentimes forgotten by fans, which is a real shame considering whenever you can take all of the material into consideration, it may be their finest hour. But that's our list. I know your list is probably different. I hope you've been putting it in the comments below while I have been talking. I'm going to be reading all of those because I'm interested in what you have to say. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I appreciate everybody who decided to check this out. My name is CoverKillerNation, and I'll talk to you guys next time when we rank them all again. Take care.